The bell above the heavy oak door didn't chime. It choked. She didn't walk into Lombra, she bled into it. Rainwater and copper mixed on the distressed floorboards, leaving a ragged trail straight toward the mahogany bar. Matteo didn't look up from the whiskey glass he was drying until she collapsed against a stool, a jagged weeping cut splitting her cheekbone. The room went dead silent. The Sicilian dropped his rag, his dark eyes locking onto her bruised skin. "Who," he whispered, a lethal calm settling over him, "hurt your face?" The neon sign in the window of Lombra buzzed with a low, irritating hum. It cast a bruised purple light over the wet pavement of the street outside, bleeding through the frosted glass and pooling on the scarred wood of the bar. It was 2 a.m. on a Tuesday. The neighborhood was dead drowned out by a relentless freezing rain that had been hammering the city since dusk. Matteo Rossi liked the rain. It washed the grime off the sidewalks and kept the rats, both literal and human, in the sewers where they belonged. He stood behind the bar, a white linen cloth in his hands, slowly polishing a heavy crystal tumbler. He didn't need to be here. He had soldiers capos and a dozen men on payroll who could run a rag over a glass, but Lombra was his anchor. It was the only place in the city that smelled of lemons, old leather, and good bourbon instead of cordite and fear. At the far end of the room, near the shadows of the rusted radiators, Luca sat nursing a black coffee. Luca was built like a cinder block, a man of few words and quick, brutal action. He was staring at the front door. He always stared at the door. Matteo set the tumbler down. The clink of glass against wood was the only sound in the room, until the heavy brass latch of the front door clicked. It didn't swing open with the usual drunken bravado. It scraped inward, caught on the heavy mat, letting in a vicious howl of wind that scattered a stack of napkins across the floor. Matteo looked up. His hands stilled. A woman stood in the threshold. She wasn't standing so much as leaning heavily against the doorframe, her knuckles white where she gripped the wet wood. Her trench coat, once a pale beige, was soaked through, plastered to her small frame, and stained dark around the waist. Water poured from her hair, matting it to her skull and obscuring her features. Luca shifted in his booth. The leather squeaked. The sound of a safety clicking off a 9mm was practically deafening in the quiet room. Matteo raised a single scarred finger. Luca froze. The woman took a step forward. Her left leg dragged. She didn't look at the men. She didn't seem to register the empty, cavernous space of the bar. Her breathing was ragged, a wet, hitching sound that carried over the jazz playing faintly from the jukebox in the corner. She took another step, her wet boot slipping on the floorboards. She pitched forward. Matteo was over the bar before she hit the ground. He moved with a terrifying, fluid speed, catching her by the shoulders just as her knees buckled. She was freezing. Through the soaked fabric of her coat, she felt like a corpse. She let out a sharp, breathless gasp of pain as his large hands gripped her, trying to twist away. "Easy," Matteo said. His voice was a low rumble, rough like gravel. She fought him, but there was no strength behind it. Her head lolled back, the wet hair falling away from her face, catching the dim overhead lighting. Matteo stopped breathing. He knew her. Nora. Nora Campbell. She ran the little independent bookstore 3 blocks down, the one squeezed between a pawn shop and a rundown laundromat. He bought a newspaper from the stand outside her shop every Sunday. They had never spoken more than a handful of words. "Good morning. Keep the change. Terrible weather." But he watched her. He knew she drank her coffee black that she hummed when she swept her stoop, and that she had a fiercely independent streak that kept her from backing down when the local junkies loitered too close to her door. The woman in his arms barely resembled the woman from the bookstore. Her bottom lip was split down the middle, swollen and crusted with drying blood. A dark, vicious bruise was blooming across her jawline, the color of crushed plums. But it was her cheek that caught his eye and froze the blood in his veins. A sharp, jagged laceration started just beneath her left eye and tore down toward her ear. It was bleeding sluggishly, a steady drip of crimson that ran down her neck and soaked into the collar of her white blouse. Someone hadn't just hit her. Someone had used a ring or a blade or glass. Someone had meant to mark her. Nora's eyelids fluttered. Her pupils were dilated, blown wide with shock. She looked at Matteo, but her gaze was unfocused, darting around his face without really seeing him. "I couldn't," she mumbled, her voice thick and slurred. The door was... It was open. "You're safe," Matteo said. He didn't recognize his own voice. It was hollowed out, entirely stripped of emotion. A dangerous sign. The men who worked for him knew that when Matteo Rossi started shouting, you ducked. When he went quiet, you prayed. He easily hoisted her up, supporting her weight against his side. She was so light. Too light. She clamped a hand over her ribs, letting out a sharp hiss. Matteo guided her toward the heavy mahogany bar, sitting her down on one of the sturdy leather stools. She slumped forward, her elbows hitting the wood, her head bowing. Blood dripped from her chin, hitting the polished surface with a quiet, sickening tap. Matteo stared at the small red puddle forming on his pristine bar. He didn't reach for a towel. He didn't call for a doctor. He reached out his large, calloused fingers, gently catching her chin. He tilted her head up into the dim light. She flinched, a raw sound of terror escaping her throat. Matteo's jaw locked. The muscles in his neck jumped. The smell of copper hit his nose, entirely overriding the scent of bourbon and rain. He looked at the split lip. He looked at the bruising jaw. He looked at the deep, weeping cut on her cheek. His eyes lifted to meet hers. They were cold, black, and utterly dead. "Who?" Matteo demanded, the words dropping like anvils into the quiet room. "Hurt your face." Nora stared at him. The room was spinning a nauseating tilt-a-whirl of shadows and neon light. Her cheek felt like it was on fire, a sharp, pulsing agony that beat in time with her heart. She tried to pull her chin out of his grip, but his fingers were like steel bands. Not painful, but completely immovable. "Let me go," she whispered. Her lips barely moved. It hurt too much to form the words. Matteo didn't blink. He didn't loosen his hold. He just stared at her, the intensity in his dark eyes, pinning her to the stool. "I asked you a question, Nora." The fact that he knew her name barely registered through the fog of her concussion. She swallowed hard, tasting pennies and bile. "It doesn't matter. I just needed to sit down. For a minute. Then I'll leave." "You're not leaving." Matteo finally released her chin. He turned his head slightly, his gaze shifting to the back of the room. "Luca, lock it. Shut the sign off." Nora heard the heavy scrape of a chair, followed by the solid, final thud of the deadbolt sliding into place. The irritating buzz of the neon sign abruptly died, plunging the front of the bar into deeper shadow. Panic flared in her chest, cold and sharp. She grabbed the edge of the bar, trying to push herself off the stool. "I can't stay here." She rasped her good hand, flying to her ribs as a fresh wave of agony hit her. "Hilda, he might look for me." Matteo had already turned his back, walking toward a heavy oak door behind the counter. He stopped. Slowly he turned his head to look over his shoulder. "Let him," Matteo said softly. He disappeared into the back room. Nora sat frozen, her chest heaving. She knew exactly whose bar she had stumbled into. Everyone in the neighborhood knew who Matteo Rossi was. He wasn't a man you went to for charity. He was the man who owned the streets, the docks, and the silence of the local precinct. He was violence wrapped in a tailored suit. She hadn't meant to come here. She had just been running blinded by the rain and the blood in her eye, pulling at the first door handle she found. Matteo returned a minute later. He had shed his suit jacket, rolling the sleeves of his crisp white shirt up to his elbows. A dark, winding tattoo snaked down his left forearm, disappearing beneath his watch. He set a heavy metal first aid box on the bar, snapping the latches open with a sharp clack. "Turn around," he instructed. "I don't need—" "Turn around, Nora." It wasn't a request. She slowly pivoted on the stool. The overhead pendant lamp caught the right side of her face. Matteo pulled a bottle of rubbing alcohol and a stack of clean white gauze from the kit. "This is going to sting," he muttered. He didn't wait for her to brace herself. He poured the alcohol onto the gauze and pressed it gently but firmly against the deep cut on her cheek. Nora cried out, her back arching. Her hands flew up, grabbing his wrists instinctively to push him away. His arms were corded with muscle solid as stone. He didn't budge. "Hold still," he murmured, his voice dropping an octave. It was shockingly gentle, entirely at odds with the brutal tension radiating from his body. She squeezed her eyes shut, tears leaking from the corners and mixing with the blood and rain on her face. She forced her hands to drop from his wrists, gripping the edge of her seat instead. Matteo worked in silence. He was methodical. He cleaned the jagged edges of the wound, his touch incredibly light, swabbing away the drying blood to assess the damage. It was deep. It would scar. The thought sent a cold, dark fury pooling in his gut. "Tell me his name," Matteo said, swiping a fresh piece of gauze over her jawline. Nora kept her eyes closed. "I don't know it." Matteo paused. He looked down at her pale, battered face. "You're lying." "I'm not." She opened her eyes. They were a pale, washed-out green, heavy with exhaustion. "He came into the shop, claimed I owed a protection fee, said the neighborhood had new management." Matteo's jaw tightened. New management. There was no new management in this city. There was only him. If someone was shaking down his streets, collecting under the guise of authority, it was a direct challenge. And they had chosen to announce it by slicing open the face of a woman he watched every Sunday. "What did he look like?" Matteo asked, throwing the bloody gauze into a nearby trash bin. He grabbed a tube of antibiotic ointment. Tall, blonde hair, pitted skin. He wore a silver ring on his index finger. Heavy, shaped like a skull. Nora winced as Matteo applied the ointment. "That's what cut me. When he hit me." Matteo froze. The ointment in his hand stopped moving. A silver skull ring. He knew the ring. He knew the man who wore it. Declan, a low-level enforcer for the O'Shea syndicate across the river. The Irish had been pushing boundaries for months, testing the waters looking for weaknesses. They had just found the exact opposite. Matteo carefully placed a butterfly bandage over the cut, pulling the edges of the skin together. He smoothed the tape down with his thumb, letting his hand linger for a fraction of a second against her unbruised jaw. Her skin was freezing, yet it burned him. "Are you going to fix my ribs next?" Nora asked, a weak, cynical attempt at deflection breaking through her fear. Matteo stepped back, dropping his hands. He picked up his white rag and slowly, methodically wiped her blood off his bar. "No." Matteo said, his voice flat and terrifyingly empty. "Luca is going to drive you to a private clinic. He's going to wait by your door until you are patched up, and then he is going to take you to a safe house." Nora stared at him, her heart hammering against her bruised ribs. "And what are you going to do?" Matteo looked up. The shadows in the bar seemed to stretch, clinging to his broad shoulders. "I'm going to take a walk," Matteo said, tossing the blood-stained rag onto the counter. "I need to talk to a man about a ring." The rain hadn't let up by the time Matteo parked his Lincoln across the street from a rusted corrugated iron fence. The sign above the gate read, "O'Reilly's Auto." It was a chop shop sitting right on the border of the warehouse district, a sore thumb of Irish territory pushing into the Italian perimeter. It smelled like motor oil, wet trash, and cheap beer. Matteo cut the engine. He sat in the dark for a full minute, watching the security camera mounted above the gate sweep lazily back and forth. He didn't bring an army. That would signal a war, a chaotic scrambling of troops. He brought Tommy and Enzo, two men in dark coats sitting in the idling sedan parked half a block down. They were professionals. They didn't speak unless spoken to, and they didn't shoot unless Matteo nodded. Matteo stepped out into the downpour. The water hit his shoulders, soaking through his cotton shirt, plastering it to his skin. He didn't care. He walked across the flooded asphalt, his leather shoes silent against the noise of the storm. He didn't bother with the gate. He walked to the side door of the adjoining office, lifted his heavy boot, and kicked the lock right out of the jamb. The wood splintered with a loud, violent crack. Inside, the harsh glare of fluorescent tube lights buzzed angrily. 4 men were gathered around a greasy folding table, a deck of cards scattered across the surface. The smell of cheap cigars and stale sweat hung thick in the air. They scrambled chairs, scraping backward, hands diving under jackets and reaching for the table. Matteo didn't draw his weapon. He just stood in the doorway, the rain dripping from his jaw, his dark eyes sweeping the room. The men froze. They knew the face. You didn't work the border without knowing what the devil looked like. Tommy and Enzo stepped in behind him, their suppressed automatics already drawn and leveled at the chests of the men at the table. "Hands flat on the metal," Tommy ordered. His voice was bored. Slowly 4 pairs of hands went flat on the folding table. Matteo walked into the room. His boots left wet tracks on the concrete floor. He didn't look at the foot soldiers. His eyes were locked on the glass-paneled door at the back of the garage, the one leading to the supervisor's office. He walked past the table, his demeanor entirely relaxed, casual like he was browsing a hardware store. He turned the knob of the office door and pushed it open. Declan was sitting behind a metal desk, hastily shoving stacks of 20s into a duffel bag. He was tall, just like Nora had said. Blonde hair slicked back, pitted skin across his cheeks from severe acne in his youth. He looked up, the color completely drained from his face. Matteo closed the door behind him. The click of the latch was the loudest sound in the small, cramped room. Rossi. Declan breathed, his hand hovering over the open drawer of his desk. "You're out of bounds. This is O'Shea territory. Stand up." Matteo's voice was a low, grating whisper. Declan hesitated, his eyes darting to the drawer. He was doing the math, trying to calculate if he could clear leather before Rossi crossed the room. He realized, looking at the dead calm in the Sicilian's eyes, that he couldn't. Declan stood. He kept his hands raised, slightly showing his palms. On his right index finger, a heavy silver ring caught the dull light of the desk lamp. It was shaped like a grinning skull. Matteo looked at the ring. The image of Nora's face, the jagged weeping tear in her pale skin, the blood soaking into the collar of her blouse, flashed in his mind. A cold, suffocating rage expanded in his chest, so dense it actually physically hurt. "You went to a bookstore tonight," Matteo said. He didn't move closer. He just stood there, letting the silence do the work. Declan swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed. "Look, we're just collecting the new tax. O'Shea said the boundary moved to 4th Street. That shop is on 4th. I was just doing my job. Your job, Matteo repeated softly. Did your job require you to backhand a civilian with a piece of cheap silver? She was resisting, mouthing off. Declan tried to puff up his chest, aiming for bravado. It's just some broad Rossi. What do you care? Matteo moved. He didn't wind up. He didn't telegraph it. He crossed the 5 feet between them in a blur of motion, grabbing Declan by the throat and slamming him backward into the cinder-block wall. The impact rattled the cheap-framed posters hanging on the plaster. Declan choked his hands, flying up to claw at Matteo's forearm. Matteo didn't let up the pressure. He leaned in his face, inches from Declan's. That broad, Matteo whispered, sweeps her stoop on my street. She breathes my air. You don't touch what exists in my city without my permission. Matteo shifted his grip, his left hand snatching Declan's right wrist. He pinned it flat against the wall. Rossi, wait! Declan gasped, his eyes going wide with sudden, blinding panic. Matteo drove his right elbow straight into the center of Declan's forearm. The bone snapped with a wet, sickening pop. Declan screamed a high, reedy sound of absolute agony. He collapsed the second Matteo released his throat, falling to his knees on the stained carpet, cradling his broken arm against his chest. He retched, gagging on the pain. Matteo stood over him, breathing evenly. He reached down, grabbing Declan by the blonde hair, yanking his head back. You tell O'Shea the boundary hasn't moved. Matteo said, his voice entirely devoid of inflection. And you tell him the next time a rat from his side of the river crosses over and bleeds a civilian on my pavement, I won't come for an arm. I'll come for heads. Matteo let him drop. He didn't look back as he walked out of the office. Tommy and Enzo were still holding the room. They backed out of the side door, slipping into the rain behind their boss. Matteo got into his car. He looked at his knuckles. They were unbruised, but he could still feel the snap of the bone against his elbow. It didn't make him feel better. The rage in his chest hadn't receded. It had merely shifted, settling into a cold, hard knot. He put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb. He needed to see her. He needed to know the bleeding had stopped. The clinic smelled of bleach and old rubbing alcohol. It was buried in the basement of a nondescript commercial building in the garment district, entirely off the books. Nora sat on the edge of the paper-lined examination table. The paper crinkled loudly every time she breathed a sharp reminder of the fire in her ribs. She was wearing a faded grey hospital gown. Her ruined blouse and soaked trench coat were sitting in a biohazard bin by the door. Dr. Evans was old. His hands were speckled with liver spots, and he wore thick, wire-rimmed glasses, but his fingers were incredibly steady. He had spent 20 minutes carefully stitching the laceration on her cheek. 12 stitches, Evans muttered, tying off the final knot with a pair of tiny forceps. You're going to have a lined there, sweetheart. I did my best, but the edge was ragged. Heavy, blunt force, sharp edge. I know, Nora rasped. Her mouth felt like it was stuffed with cotton. The local anesthetic had numbed the left side of her face, making her lip droop slightly. 2 cracked ribs on the right side. He began tightly wrapping a wide, elastic bandage around her torso. You breathe shallow. You don't lift anything heavier than a coffee mug. You take these. He tossed a small orange pill bottle onto the metal counter. Every 6 hours. Don't mix them with booze. Nora nodded once. She didn't have the energy to speak. She felt hollowed out, scraped clean by the adrenaline crash. Her bookstore was empty. The cash register was probably smashed. Her whole quiet, carefully constructed life had been shattered by a man looking for a few $100. Luca was standing against the wall near the door. He hadn't moved a muscle in an hour. He was a terrifying presence, massive and silent, but strangely Nora found herself glad he was there. When a nurse had walked in, unannounced, Luca had stepped between Nora and the door before the woman even fully crossed the threshold. "You're done," Evans said, stepping back and pulling off his latex gloves. "Luca, get her out of here. I have a guy with a gunshot wound coming in from the docks in 10 minutes. Luca nodded. He walked over, picking up a folded stack of clothes from a chair, sweatpants, and an oversized black hoodie he had procured from God knows where. He set them on the table next to her. "Dress?" Luca grunted. He turned his back to give her privacy. Nora moved slowly. Every stretch of her arms sent a sickening spike of pain through her ribs. Getting the hoodie over her head was a monumental task, but she managed it sinking into the heavy fleece. It smelled like fabric softener and faint cigar smoke. The ride to the safe house was a blur of streetlights and rain hitting the windshield of Luca's SUV. Nora leaned her head against the cool glass of the passenger window. She didn't ask where they were going. It didn't matter. She couldn't go back to her apartment above the shop. The man with the skull ring knew where she lived. They pulled into an underground parking garage of a high-end high-rise overlooking the river. Luca led her up a private elevator that opened directly into a penthouse. It was massive, minimalist, and entirely cold. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the glittering, rain-swept city. The furniture was black leather and dark wood. There were no pictures, no books, no clutter. It looked like a hotel room waiting for a ghost. "Bedroom is down the hall. Left," Luca said. "Water in the fridge. I'll be by the door." He walked over to a chair near the elevator bank and sat down, crossing his thick arms. He was in for the night. Nora didn't argue. She walked down the hallway, finding the bedroom. A massive, king-sized bed dominated the space. She didn't get under the covers. She felt dirty, covered in the grim residue of the night. She just curled into a tight ball on top of the dark duvet, pulling her knees up to her chest to protect her ribs. She stared at the wall. She didn't cry. The tears wouldn't come. Just a numb, heavy disbelief. 2 hours passed. The city outside grew completely silent. The soft ding of the elevator opening made her flinch. She heard heavy footsteps on the hardwood floor, low voices in the living room. Luca's rumble. Then a different voice. Darker. Rougher. Footsteps approached the bedroom. The door was already open. Matteo stopped in the doorway. The hallway light cast his face in sharp relief. He had taken off his tie. The top buttons of his shirt were undone. He looked exhausted, the skin around his eyes tight with a brutal kind of weariness. Nora sat up, slowly wincing. Matteo stepped into the room. He didn't turn on the overhead light. He just stood near the foot of the bed looking at her. His eyes tracked over the heavy bandage on her cheek, the swollen, bruised lump of her lip, the way she guarded her ribs. "The doctor said 12 stitches, Matteo said. His voice was quiet in the large room. "He did good work," Nora replied, her voice thick. "It barely hurts right now." "You're lying." She offered a small, broken smile. "A little?" Matteo looked down at his hands. Nora saw the faint smear of dark grease and something rust-colored on his knuckles. He caught her looking and shoved his hands into his pockets. "Is he dead?" she asked. The question felt foreign in her mouth. She was a woman who recommended fantasy novels to teenagers. She shouldn't be asking a mob boss if he murdered someone on her behalf. "No," Matteo said flatly. "But he will never use his right arm again. He won't be coming back to your shop." Nora exhaled a long, shaky breath. "Thank you." "Don't thank me." Matteo's voice turned harsh, almost angry. He looked up, his black eyes pinning her down. This was my fault. They pushed into my territory because they thought I was distracted. They used you to send a message to me. I'm just a bookseller, Matteo." It was the first time she used his name. It hung in the air between them, intimate and dangerous. "Not anymore," he said softly. "You're a liability to them now, and a target." Nora's stomach plummeted. "So what do? I can't stay here forever. I have a business." Matteo walked around the bed, stopping a foot away from where she sat. He was so large, he seemed to block out the windows entirely. "You stay here until the stitches come out. Until you can breathe without wincing," Matteo ordered. He reached out his hand, hovering near her face, before he forced it back down to his side. "And then I figure out how to keep you alive." Morning came, not with sunlight, but with a flat grey wash that crept over the city and bled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse. Nora woke up to a ceiling she didn't recognize, and a body that felt like it had been run over by a freight train. She tried to sit up. Her breath hitched, catching sharply in her chest as the cracked ribs ground together. She let out a low hiss, falling back against the mattress. She lay there for 10 minutes, staring at the smooth plaster above her, meticulously cataloguing the pain. Her jaw throbbed with a dull, heavy ache. Her cheek was tight, the stitches pulling uncomfortably against her skin whenever she swallowed. Slowly using her left arm to bear her weight, she rolled out of the heavy duvet. She was still wearing the oversized black hoodie Luca had given her. It swamped her small frame, the hem hitting just above her knees. Her bare feet touched the cold hardwood floor. She limped into the adjoining master bathroom. It was entirely marble, sterile, and vast. She gripped the edge of the sink and looked in the mirror. She barely recognized herself. The left side of her face was a swollen, distorted landscape of violence. The skin around her eye had blossomed into a sickening shade of violet rimmed with sickly yellow. Her bottom lip was split and scabbed, but it was the bandage on her cheek that held her attention, a stark white rectangle interrupting the bruised canvas. A permanent marker of the night her quiet life ended. She turned on the faucet, let the water run until it was ice cold, and carefully dabbed at the uninjured parts of her face with a hand towel. When she finally walked out into the main living space, the apartment was quiet. The rain had stopped, replaced by a low-hanging fog that obscured the river. Luca was gone from the chair by the door. In the open-plan kitchen, Matteo stood with his back to her. He was dressed in dark trousers and a crisp white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to the elbows. A leather shoulder holster was strapped across his back, the dark metal of a handgun resting securely under his left arm. He was holding a phone to his ear, speaking in rapid, low Italian. The cadence was sharp, angry. Nora stopped at the edge of the kitchen island. She didn't want to interrupt, but the floorboards creaked under her weight. Matteo stopped speaking immediately. He didn't turn around right away. He ended the call with a sharp press of his thumb, set the phone face down on the granite counter, and took a slow breath. When he finally turned to face her, his expression was completely unreadable. The dangerous, simmering violence from the night before was buried under a mask of cold control. "You should be resting," he said. "I couldn't sleep." Her voice was raspy, still rough from the screaming she had done in her own head the night before. "Where's Luca?" "Downstairs, watching the garage." Matteo turned his attention to a sleek espresso machine on the counter. He pulled a shot, the rich smell of dark roast coffee immediately filling the sterile air. "Are you hungry?" "No." He slid a small ceramic cup across the island toward her anyway. "Drink it. It helps with the headache." Nora stepped up to the stool but didn't sit. Sitting required bending her torso, and she wasn't ready to test her ribs again just yet. She picked up the espresso with both hands, letting the heat seep into her cold palms. She took a sip. It was impossibly strong, entirely bitter. It grounded her. "I need to make a phone call," Nora said. Matteo leaned against the counter opposite her. He crossed his arms over his chest, the holster shifting slightly. "To who?" "My landlord. The police. Someone." She gripped the cup tighter. "My shop door is kicked in. The register is probably empty. I have inventory sitting in the damp. I can't just vanish into a penthouse and pretend I don't have a life down there." "You don't have a life down there right now. Down there you are leverage." Matteo's voice was devoid of sympathy. It was a simple statement of fact. "If you call the police, they will ask who did it. You give them a description. They pull the file on Declan. O'Shea finds out you're talking. He won't send someone with a silver ring next time, Nora. He'll send someone with a can of gasoline." Nora's stomach twisted. "So you're keeping me hostage. I am keeping you breathing." Matteo pushed off the counter. He walked around the island, stopping entirely too close to her. The smell of his cologne would smoke bergamot and danger, mixed with the coffee. "Your shop is boarded up. I sent 2 of my men there at dawn. They secured the door. The register was empty, but I will reimburse you for every cent. Your books are safe." She looked up at him. He was terrifyingly large, a man built for intimidation. Yet he hadn't raised his voice once. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. The question hung in the quiet air, heavy and loaded. "I buy a newspaper from you on Sundays. That's it. You don't know me. You went to war last night for a stranger." Matteo stared down at her. His dark eyes flicked to the bandage on her cheek, a muscle in his jaw jumping. For a split second, the cold mask cracked, revealing something desperate and violent underneath. "You aren't a stranger," Matteo said softly. "And I don't let animals bleed the things that belong on my streets. Drink your coffee. I have to go to work." 3 days passed in absolute suffocating isolation. The penthouse was a gilded cage. It had everything she could possibly need. A fridge stocked with fresh food delivered silently by Luca, a closet full of expensive neutral-toned loungewear in exactly her size, and a sprawling view of a city she was no longer allowed to walk in. The bruising on Nora's face had deepened, turning into a lurid mottled masterpiece of dark purple and bile yellow. The swelling in her lip had gone down, but the stitches in her cheek pulled and itched with maddening persistence. She walked the length of the apartment, constantly pacing off the anxiety holding her ribs every time she coughed. Matteo was a ghost. He left before she woke up and returned long after she retreated to the master bedroom. But the evidence of his presence was always there. A half-empty glass of scotch on the coffee table, a dark tie discarded over the back of a leather chair, the faint scent of smoke and exhaustion clinging to the air in the mornings. The city, however, was not quiet. On the afternoon of the 4th day, Nora was sitting on the sofa, staring blankly at the muted television. A breaking news banner crawled across the bottom of the screen. 3-alarm fire destroys warehouse in the meatpacking district. Arson suspected. The helicopter footage showed a massive brick building engulfed in orange flames, thick black smoke billowing into the grey sky. Nora didn't need to know the address to know who owned it. O'Shea had answered for Declan's broken arm. The war Matteo had started for her was no longer confined to back rooms and chop shops. It was burning down the city blocks. A cold spike of guilt drove itself into her chest. She turned the television off. The sudden silence in the penthouse was deafening. It was past midnight when she finally heard the heavy front door open. The metallic clack of the deadbolt sliding home sounded louder than usual. Nora was sitting in the dark by the window, a blanket pulled over her legs. She watched Matteo walk into the living room. He didn't turn on the lights. The ambient glow from the city below cast him in sharp, jagged silhouettes. He looked entirely wrecked. He shrugged off his suit jacket, tossing it blindly toward the sofa. It missed landing on the floor. He didn't bother picking it up. He walked straight to the bar cart, grabbed a bottle of bourbon, and poured a generous measure into a glass. He drank it straight, his head thrown back. When he lowered the glass, he saw her sitting in the shadows. He froze. "You're awake," he rasped. His voice was completely shot raw from shouting over roaring flames and sirens. "It's hard to sleep," Nora said quietly. She stood up, leaving the blanket on the chair. She walked slowly toward him. As she got closer, the smell hit her: acrid wood smoke, melting plastic, and the undeniable metallic tang of blood. Matteo looked away from her, staring down into his empty glass. "Go back to bed, Nora." She didn't listen. She stopped a few feet away from him. The dim light caught the side of his face. There was a smear of black soot across his forehead, and a fresh, angry cut along his jawline. His knuckles, resting heavily on the bar cart, were split and bleeding sluggishly. "Your warehouse?" she said. It wasn't a question. Matteo set the glass down. It was empty, just inventory. "We got everyone out. Because of me." "No." He turned his head, his dark eyes locking onto hers with sudden, fierce intensity. "Because O'Shea is a rabid dog who needed an excuse to bite. If it wasn't you, it would have been someone else next week. You were just the catalyst." "You're bleeding," she pointed out, ignoring his justification. Matteo looked down at his knuckles as if he had no idea they were split open. He let out a harsh, bitter exhale. "It's nothing. Go to bed." "Sit down, Matteo." He looked back at her, his brows pulling together in confusion. The boss of the Sicilian syndicate wasn't used to being given orders by a 110-pound woman in an oversized sweater. But he looked at her face, the fading bruises, the stark white bandage, the absolute lack of fear in her green eyes, and he found he couldn't refuse her. He dropped heavily onto the nearest leather bar stool. He looked massive, broken, and entirely exhausted. Nora walked into the kitchen. She found a clean dish towel, ran it under warm water, and walked back. She stood between his spread knees. She didn't ask for permission. She just took his right hand. His fist was clenched tight, the muscles corded and rigid. Gently she ran her thumb over the back of his hand until his fingers slowly uncurled. He let out a low breath, completely surrendering the weight of his hand to her. She pressed the warm, damp cloth against his split knuckles, wiping away the drying blood and soot. He hissed slightly at the sting, his jaw clenching, but he didn't pull away. "You fix my face," Nora murmured, her eyes focused entirely on her task. "I clean your hands." "Is that how this works now?" Matteo stared at the top of her head. He could smell her shampoo, something cheap and floral that smelled better than anything he had ever bought. "You shouldn't be cleaning my hands. You shouldn't be anywhere near me." "Then why did you lock the door the night I walked in?" She looked up the damp cloth resting against his ruined skin. Matteo didn't answer right away. He reached up with his free hand. He didn't touch her, but his fingers hovered inches from the bandage on her cheek, trembling ever so slightly, with a restrained, desperate need. "Because," Matteo whispered, his voice dropping to a gravelly ruin, "if I had let you walk back out into the rain, I would have burned this entire city to the ground, just looking for you." The stitches came out on a Tuesday, exactly 1 week after Nora had bled onto the floorboards of Lombra. Dr. Evans arrived at the penthouse just after 9 in the morning, carrying his battered black leather bag. He smelled heavily of peppermints and stale tobacco. He didn't ask how she was feeling. He just gestured for her to sit in the harsh morning light, flooding through the floor-to-ceiling windows, put on his reading glasses, and went to work with a pair of tiny silver scissors. Matteo stood in the kitchen. He had a cup of black coffee in his hand, but he wasn't drinking it. He watched the doctor's hands with the unblinking focus of a hawk. "There," Evans grunted, pulling the last black thread free and dropping it onto a sterile gauze pad. "Keep it clean. Use the silicone gel I left on the counter. Twice a day. It'll fade, but it won't disappear. You're marked." Nora didn't flinch at the blunt assessment. She already knew. She had spent the last 7 days memorizing the shape of her own ruin in the bathroom mirror. The swelling had finally subsided, leaving a pale, jagged line carving a trench through her cheek. It looked angry. It looked permanent. "Thank you, Doctor," she said quietly. Evans packed his bag, nodded to Matteo, and let himself out. The heavy click of the deadbolt echoed in the quiet apartment. Nora stood up. She touched her cheek. The skin felt tight numb in the center and hypersensitive at the edges. She turned to look at Matteo. He hadn't moved from the kitchen island. "I want to see my shop," she said. It wasn't a request. She had spent a week locked in a glass box while the city burned around her. The news had reported 2 more fires and a drive-by shooting outside an Irish pub across the river. The war was escalating, and she was sitting on a white leather sofa watching game shows. Matteo finally took a sip of his coffee. "No, the stitches are out. My ribs only hurt when I laugh, and I haven't had much reason to do that lately." Nora walked toward him. The oversized hoodie had been replaced by her own clothes jeans and a grey sweater Luca had retrieved from her apartment days ago. "I need to see what's left. I need to get my ledger, my laptop, and the lockbox from the back office. If I'm going to be stuck in this Mafia Witness Protections program, I need to pay my vendors." Matteo set his mug down. The ceramic clicked sharply against the granite counter. "It's not safe. Then bring an army." Nora met his dark eyes, refusing to back down. "You own the streets, don't you? That's what you told Declan. Prove it. Take me to my bookstore." A muscle in Matteo's jaw jumped. He hated when she threw his own words back at him. He hated that she wasn't terrified of him, but mostly he hated that he couldn't say no to her. 15 minutes, Matteo rasped. "Get your coat." The drive to the bookstore was suffocatingly tense. They didn't take Matteo's Lincoln. They took a heavily armored black SUV, driven by Enzo with Tommy riding shotgun. A second SUV trailed right on their bumper. Nora sat in the back seat next to Matteo. The space between them was charged heavy with the unspoken weight of the night she had cleaned the blood from his knuckles. He hadn't touched her since. He had barely spoken to her. The SUV pulled to the curb on 4th Street. The rain had returned a persistent icy drizzle that slicked the pavement. Nora looked out the tinted window. Her breath caught in her throat. The large display window, the one she meticulously painted every holiday season, was gone. It had been replaced by thick slabs of raw plywood, bolted crudely into the brickwork. The heavy oak door was splintered around the lock, secured by a heavy iron padlock that hadn't been there a week ago. It looked like a tomb. Matteo signaled to Tommy. The front passenger door opened, and Tommy stepped out into the rain, scanning the rooftops and alleyways, before drawing a key from his pocket and walking to the padlock. 5 minutes, Nora." Matteo said, his voice a low rumble near her ear. "We get your things and we leave. You don't linger." She nodded mechanically. Matteo slid out, first his hand, instinctively going to the small of his back, resting over the grip of his concealed weapon. He offered her his left hand. She took it. His palm was warm, calloused, and immensely strong. They stepped into the shop. The smell hit her instantly, damp paper mildew and stale air. The front half of the store was a disaster. Water had blown in through the broken window before Matteo's men had boarded it up. The front display tables were overturned. Hardcovers were strewn across the floor, their pages warped and swollen with dirty rainwater. The antique cash register had been smashed to pieces, wires and gears scattered behind the counter. Nora walked slowly down the central aisle. Her boots crunched on broken glass. It sounded like bones snapping. This was her life. This was the quiet, peaceful existence she had built, from scratch, entirely decimated, because a thug wanted a few $100. The sheer senselessness of it washed over her, a cold, suffocating wave of despair. She stopped by a collapsed bookshelf, staring down at a ruined copy of a first edition Hemingway she had spent months sourcing. The cover was torn in half. Matteo stood right behind her. He didn't offer empty apologies. He didn't tell her it would be fine. He looked at the ruin, his dark eyes categorizing the damage, filing it away, as another debt O'Shea owed him. "The back office," Matteo prompted, gently touching her elbow. Nora blinked, pulling herself out of the spiral. "Right. The office." She navigated the debris, leading him to a small, cramped room at the back of the shop. It was untouched. The door had been locked. She grabbed her laptop from the desk, shoving it into a canvas tote bag. She crouched down, pulling a heavy metal lockbox from the bottom drawer of a filing cabinet. She stood up, turning to face Matteo. "I have it. We can go." "Good." Matteo turned toward the doorway. He took exactly one step before the front of the bookstore exploded. The sound wasn't a bang. It was a deafening, percussive roar that tore the air from the room. The heavy plywood barricading the front window splintered inward, shredded by a localized explosive charge. A thick cloud of pulverized brick sawdust and smoke violently billowed into the narrow aisles. Matteo didn't hesitate. Before the shockwave fully registered, he tackled Nora. He hit her waist, driving her backward away from the doorway and slamming them both to the floor behind the heavy steel filing cabinet. The impact forced the air from her lungs in a sharp gasp, jarring her healing ribs. White-hot pain flared in her chest. "Stay down!" Matteo roared over the ringing in her ears. Automatic gunfire immediately followed the explosion. The staccato crack, crack, crack was terrifyingly loud in the enclosed space. Bullets chewed through the drywall of the office, sending chunks of plaster raining down on them. Books literally exploded off the shelves in the main shop pages, fluttering through the dusty air like dead leaves. Nora squeezed her eyes shut, pressing her hands over her ears. She couldn't breathe. The dust was choking her, coating her throat in dry, bitter chalk. Matteo was half lying over her, shielding her body with his own. He drew his weapon, a heavy matte black 1911, racking the slide with a sharp metallic clack. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated murder. The civilized man in the tailored suit was gone. This was the warlord of the Sicilian syndicate. "Tommy!" Matteo shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Front door is pinned." Tommy's voice echoed from somewhere near the front counter, followed by a burst of return fire. "3 shooters Irish." "Hold the line," Matteo yelled back. He looked down at Nora. His black eyes swept over her, searching for fresh blood. "Are you hit?" She shook her head wildly, unable to form words. She clutched the canvas tote bag to her chest like a shield. "Do not move from this spot." he ordered, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. "Do you understand me? You press your back against the metal, and you do not move." He didn't wait for her to answer. Matteo rolled off her, using the edge of the filing cabinet for cover. He peered around the door frame into the smoke-filled shop. Nora watched him. She couldn't look away. Two men in dark tactical gear were advancing down the central aisle, their rifles raised, moving methodically through the ruined bookshelves. They were hunting. Matteo didn't lay down suppressive fire. He didn't waste bullets. He stepped out from the cover of the office door, his arm extending with absolute mechanical precision. He fired twice. The sound in the small room was physical, a punch to the eardrums. The lead shooter's head snapped back violently, a mist of crimson spraying against the poetry section. The man dropped like a stone, dead, before his knees hit the floorboards. The second shooter pivoted, bringing his rifle to bear on the office doorway. He squeezed the trigger. Wood splintered inches from Matteo's head, showering his dark hair in shards. Matteo didn't flinch. He didn't retreat. He adjusted his aim slightly and pulled the trigger 3 times in rapid succession. 2 rounds caught the shooter in the chest, driving him backward into a display table. The third caught him in the throat as he fell. The gunfire from the front of the store suddenly ceased, replaced by the heavy thud of footsteps, and Tommy shouting, "Clear front is clear!" Silence fell over the bookstore, heavy ringing and thick with the smell of cordite and copper. Nora sat frozen against the filing cabinet. She couldn't stop shaking. Her teeth were chattering, a violent, involuntary tremor racking her entire body. She stared at the doorway. Matteo slowly lowered his weapon. He stood in the threshold for a long moment, staring at the bodies in the aisle. He was breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling beneath his tailored coat. Slowly he engaged the safety on his pistol and tucked it back into his holster. He turned around. The look on his face was one Nora had never seen before. It wasn't anger. It wasn't cold control, it was regret. He looked at her, huddled on the floor, covered in plaster dust, her eyes wide with shock, and he knew he had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. She had seen the monster. He walked over to her, crouching down so he was at eye level. He didn't reach for her. He kept his hands resting on his knees. "Nora," he said softly. She flinched. The tiny, involuntary movement was worse than a bullet. Matteo closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, absorbing the blow. "They tracked the SUV." Matteo said, his voice tight. "They knew I would come here eventually. It was an ambush." "You killed them," she whispered. Her voice was raspy, barely audible. "Yes." Just like that. Matteo opened his eyes. They were hard, black stones. "If I didn't kill them, they would have walked into this room and put a bullet in your head, just to hurt me. This is the world, Nora. It is ugly, it is violent, and it does not care about your books." He finally reached out his large, blood-spattered hand, gently grasping her shoulder. "Can you walk?" he asked. She nodded slowly, her grip on the tote bag turning her knuckles white. Matteo stood pulling her to her feet. He kept his arm wrapped tight around her waist, supporting her weight. He guided her out of the office. He intentionally stepped between her and the bodies on the floor, blocking her line of sight. But she still saw the blood pooling on the warped floorboards, mixing with the rainwater and the ruined pages of Hemingway. They walked out into the cold rain. The street was chaos. Sirens were wailing in the distance, growing louder. Enzo had the armored SUV running, the back door hanging open. Matteo shoved her inside, climbing in right behind her. "Drive," Matteo ordered. "Get us back to the tower." The SUV peeled away from the curb, leaving the ruined bookstore and the dead men behind. Nora sat in the back seat, staring blankly at her trembling hands. The war wasn't a news banner on a television screen anymore. It was real. It was sitting right next to her, bleeding onto the leather seats, smelling of gunpowder and rain. The ride up the private elevator was entirely silent. The hum of the mechanics and the slight shift of the cables were the only sounds cutting through the ringing in Nora's ears. When the stainless steel doors finally slid open, Luca was waiting in the foyer. The massive enforcer took one look at Matteo's blood-spattered shirt and the grey plaster dust coating Nora's hair, and his hand immediately dropped to his sidearm. "Call the capos." Matteo ordered, his voice a flat, deadened instrument. He didn't break stride as he walked past Luca into the penthouse. "Pull everyone off the docks. Lock down the borders. O'Shea wants a war, he just bought one. Nobody sleeps tonight." Luca nodded, once his expression turning to granite, and disappeared back into the elevator. Nora stood in the center of the vast living room. The canvas tote bag slipped from her numb fingers, hitting the hardwood floor with a heavy thud. She looked down at her hands. They were coated in white dust and trembling violently. The adrenaline was finally leaving her system, replaced by a cold, hollow shock that threatened to buckle her knees. "Go to the bathroom," Matteo said. He was standing by the windows, his back to her, staring out at the grey, weeping city. "Wash the dust off. You're breathing it in." She didn't argue. She moved like an automaton, putting one foot in front of the other until she reached the master bath. The harsh fluorescent lights flickered on, illuminating her reflection in the massive mirror. She looked like a ghost. Her skin was ashen, her hair matted with debris. The pale, jagged scar on her cheek stood out in stark relief, a brutal reminder of the violence that had permanently tethered her to this world. She turned on the faucet, waiting for the water to run hot. She cupped her hands, bringing the water up to her face, scrubbing furiously. She scrubbed until the water ran clear, until her skin was flushed and raw, until the smell of gunpowder and blood finally stopped clinging to the inside of her nose. When she walked back out into the living room 20 minutes later, she felt hollowed out, scraped down to the bone. Matteo was sitting at the heavy oak dining table. A leather duffel bag sat on the chair next to him. He was tossing bundles of cash into it, his movements sharp, mechanical, and entirely devoid of hesitation. He had changed his shirt, discarding the blood-stained white cotton for a dark charcoal Henley, but he couldn't wash away the exhaustion carved into his features. He stopped when he heard her bare feet on the floorboards. "I have a plane waiting at Teterboro," Matteo said. He didn't look up at her. He picked up a thick manila envelope and tossed it into the duffel. "It leaves in 2 hours. It will take you to Denver. There is a house there, paid for in cash under a different name. The envelope has enough money to open a new shop, buy a car, and live quietly for the next 20 years. Nora stared at the black leather bag. "You're sending me away. I am keeping you alive." Matteo finally looked at her. His black eyes were entirely hollow. "They know you matter to me. They know I will burn my own men to keep you breathing. That makes you the biggest target in this city. You can't stay here, Nora." "Because of what I saw?" she asked, her voice quiet but incredibly steady. "Because I saw you kill 2 men. Matteo flinched. The tiny, involuntary movement betrayed the iron grip he had on his emotions. "Because I am the man who killed them. Because I didn't think twice. I am violence, Nora. I bring it with me everywhere I go, and it just destroyed your life. I won't let it put you in the ground." He zipped the duffel bag closed with a sharp, final scrape of metal. He stood up, grabbing the handles. "Get your things," he ordered. Nora didn't move. She looked at the duffel bag, and then she looked at the man holding it. The warlord of the Sicilian syndicate, a man who commanded killers and ruled the streets with an iron fist, was trying to exile the only thing he cared about, because he thought he was poison. "No," Nora said. Matteo stopped. The heavy bag hung from his grip. "This isn't a negotiation." "Yes, it is." Nora closed the distance between them. She didn't let the fear of his world stop her. She reached out, placing her small, pale hand directly over his white-knuckled grip on the bag. "My life is here. My shop is in ruins. My inventory is destroyed, but I belong in this city. I am not running to Denver to hide in a house I didn't buy with money I didn't earn. Nora, they will come for you. Then you will stop them." The absolute certainty in her voice hit him like a physical blow. Matteo stared down at her, the breath catching in his throat. "You saw what I am," he whispered, a desperate, raw admission. "You saw what I do. I saw a man step in front of a rifle for me." Nora corrected her voice, dropping to a fierce, low register. "I saw a man who didn't let me bleed out on his bar. I know exactly what you are, Matteo. And I'm not leaving." She pulled the duffel bag from his grip. He let it go. It hit the floor with a heavy thud, the cash and the fake identity entirely forgotten. Matteo raised his hands, his fingers trembling slightly as they hovered in the space between them. Slowly, carefully, he cupped her face. His calloused thumb brushed against the jagged edge of her scar. He didn't look at her like she was broken. He looked at her like she was the only thing holding him together. He leaned down, pressing his forehead against hers. The war was waiting for them outside the glass walls of the penthouse. The city was going to burn. But in the quiet dark of the living room, surrounded by the ruins of the life she used to know, Nora closed her eyes and leaned into the monster. Nora's quiet life is gone forever, but she's no longer just a bookseller. Caught in the crossfire is the Queen Matteo Rossi, will burn the city down to protect. The Irish syndicate drew first blood, but the Sicilians are about to finish the war. Will Matteo and Nora survive the brutal underworld politics, or will the violence consume them both? If you loved this dark, gritty mafia romance, do not scroll past, hit that like button, share this video with your fellow dark romance addicts, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a chapter. Drop a comment below. What should Matteo do to O'Shea? See you in the next story.